In March of 2019, wildlife photographer Marcus Hjelm drove his rental car through the Arctic darkness of northern Norway, chasing lights that danced across a sky most people would never see. He was 34 years old, a man who'd spent a decade photographing the world's most remote places, and he'd made this particular journey to capture the northern lights dozens of times before. On March 12th, he called his girlfriend Elena from his satellite phone, his voice crackling through the static. "The Aurora's perfect tonight," he said, "like nothing I've ever seen. I might stay out longer than planned." 18 months later, hikers found his body perfectly preserved in ice, sitting upright in a photographer's crouch, eye pressed to his camera's viewfinder, frozen in the act of capturing something that shouldn't exist. The final images on his memory card would raise questions that Norwegian authorities still refuse to answer. Marcus Hjelm had the kind of restless energy that made ordinary life feel like suffocation. Friends described him as a man who needed wilderness the way other people needed air, not for recreation, but for survival. He'd grown up in Bergen, the son of a fisherman who understood the pull of harsh places, and he'd inherited both his father's respect for nature's power and his stubborn refusal to let that power dictate his limits. By 34, Marcus had built a reputation photographing subjects other professionals avoided. While landscape photographers chased golden hour light in accessible locations, Marcus disappeared into places where rescue would be impossible if something went wrong. His portfolio included storm systems in the North Sea, ice caves in Greenland that required technical climbing to reach, and wildlife in Siberia where temperatures could kill an unprotected human in minutes. His photographs appeared in National Geographic, BBC Wildlife, and galleries across Europe, but his true obsession was the Aurora Borealis. "The lights change you," Marcus had written in his journal the year before his disappearance. "Every photographer who's serious about aurora work knows this. You don't just photograph them, they get inside you. There's something alive about the way they move, something that feels almost intentional. I've seen aurora that seemed to respond to my presence, patterns that shifted the moment I raised my camera. It sounds crazy written down, but up there in the dark, nothing sounds crazy anymore." Elena Anderson had been with Marcus for 3 years, long enough to understand that she was dating a man who belonged as much to the Arctic as he did to her. She'd learned not to ask when he'd be back from his photography trips because he never knew. "Marcus didn't chase ordinary aurora," she said later. "He waited for the extraordinary ones, the once-in-a-lifetime displays that most photographers never see. He had this ability to predict when conditions would be perfect, not just the scientific forecasts, but something intuitive. He'd feel it days before the aurora appeared, get restless, start checking weather patterns obsessively. Then he'd disappear north until he found what he was looking for." In March 2019, that restlessness had been building for weeks. Solar activity predictions showed potential for significant aurora displays, and Marcus had been monitoring conditions with the intensity of a man tracking prey. On March 10th, he'd loaded his equipment, 2 camera bodies, 4 lenses, tripods, batteries designed for extreme cold, and enough survival gear for a week into a rental Volvo and driven north towards Svalbard, the archipelago that sits closer to the North Pole than to mainland Norway. The Svalbard region exists at the edge of the habitable world. Even in March, temperatures hover around -20 Celsius, and the landscape consists primarily of frozen tundra, glaciers, and mountains that rise like sleeping giants from the permafrost. It's a place where polar bears outnumber humans, where the sun doesn't rise for months at a time, and where aurora displays can stretch across the entire visible sky like curtains of colored light suspended between Earth and space. For photographers, Svalbard represents both ultimate opportunity and ultimate risk. The aurora there can be spectacular. Dancing sheets of green, blue, and purple light that photograph like nothing found anywhere else on Earth, but the isolation is absolute. Cell phone service doesn't exist outside the few small settlements. Rescue operations are limited by weather, darkness, and distances that can stretch for hundreds of kilometers across terrain, where a wrong turn becomes a death sentence. Marcus understood these risks better than most. His preparation was methodical, almost ritualistic. He studied topographical maps until he could navigate by memory, packed redundant safety equipment, and always filed detailed travel plans with Norwegian authorities. His satellite phone was his lifeline, a device that could reach emergency services even from the most remote locations, as long as it had power and clear sky access. The cabin Marcus rented sat 43 kilometers from the nearest settlement, a small wooden structure heated by a diesel generator and surrounded by frozen wilderness that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The rental agency described it as rustic, but adequate for experienced outdoorsmen, which meant it had basic shelter and little else. Marcus had stayed there before. He knew its limitations and had planned accordingly. On March 11th, he'd set up his base camp, organizing equipment with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. His cameras were charged, memory cards empty, lens filters cleaned and tested. Weather forecasts confirmed what his instincts had been telling him. Conditions were aligning for significant aurora activity. Solar wind data showed a moderate geomagnetic storm approaching Earth, the kind of celestial event that could produce aurora visible as far south as Germany. But Marcus wasn't interested in the aurora that southern observers might glimpse. He wanted the full display, the kind that only revealed itself to those willing to venture into the Arctic night. March 12th began with perfect clarity. The sky was cloudless, the air so cold it seemed to crystallize sound itself. Marcus spent the day scouting locations, searching for compositions that would frame the aurora against the dramatic landscape of ice and stone. He found his spot around sunset, a ridge that offered clear views of both the northern horizon and a glacier that caught starlight like fractured glass. At 9:30 p.m., he called Elena. The conversation was brief, interrupted by the satellite phone's characteristic delay and static, but his excitement was unmistakable. "The aurora's already starting," he said. "Faint green bands on the horizon, but the solar data says it's going to intensify. This could be the display I've been waiting for." "How long will you stay out there?" Elena asked. "However long it takes. The forecast shows clear skies all night. If the aurora builds like the predictions suggest, I might be shooting until dawn. Just be safe. Call me when you're heading back." "Always do." At 11:16 p.m., Marcus made his final call to Elena. This conversation lasted less than a minute, just long enough to report that the aurora was exceeding all expectations. "It's incredible," he said, his voice tight with concentration. "Like nothing I've ever seen. The entire sky's alive. I'm getting shots that—" The call cut off abruptly, the satellite connection lost to atmospheric interference. Elena wasn't immediately concerned. Satellite phones were notoriously unreliable during geomagnetic storms, and the aurora activity Marcus was photographing would have been causing significant electromagnetic disturbance. She'd learned to expect communication blackouts during his most productive shoots. She went to sleep expecting to hear from him the next morning. The morning brought silence. By noon on March 13th, Elena's concern had shifted to worry. By evening, worry had become fear. Marcus had never failed to check in within 24 hours of his planned return, no matter how spectacular the photography conditions. She called the Norwegian authorities. The search began at dawn on March 14th. A helicopter crew flew to Marcus's last known location, following GPS coordinates from his satellite phone's final transmission. They found his rental car parked outside the cabin, undisturbed except for a thin layer of snow across the windshield. Inside the cabin, his belongings were organized exactly as he'd left them. Sleeping bag unused, food supplies untouched, spare equipment laid out with characteristic precision. What they didn't find was Marcus himself or any of his primary camera gear. The helicopter crew expanded their search in widening circles around the cabin, looking for any sign of the missing photographer. The landscape below was a maze of snow-covered ridges, frozen lakes, and ice fields that could hide a human body indefinitely. Visibility was excellent, clear skies and adequate daylight, but the terrain revealed nothing. Search teams on the ground arrived that afternoon. These were professionals, experienced Arctic rescue specialists who understood how people disappeared in this environment and where bodies were typically found. They began with the most likely scenarios: medical emergency near the cabin, equipment failure leading to disorientation, a fall through ice into one of the area's frozen waterways. They found tracks almost immediately. Boot prints led from the cabin toward the ridge Marcus had mentioned to Elena, clearly visible in snow that had fallen after his disappearance. The tracks were methodical, purposeful, not the erratic pattern of someone lost or injured. They followed established routes that Marcus had scouted during the day, suggesting he'd known exactly where he was going. But the tracks told a strange story. They led away from the cabin in a straight line, climbing toward the ridge where Marcus had planned to photograph. The stride was normal, the depth consistent with someone carrying heavy camera equipment. But approximately 2 kilometers from the cabin, the tracks simply ended. Not at a cliff edge or a frozen stream where falling through ice might explain disappearance. Not at a point where wind might have obscured them. The footprints led across level ground for 2 kilometers, then stopped in the middle of open terrain as if Marcus had simply vanished mid-step. The search teams expanded their efforts. They brought in dogs trained to locate human remains even under snow and ice. They used ground-penetrating radar to scan areas where a body might have been buried by weather. Helicopter sweeps covered hundreds of square kilometers, photographing the terrain from multiple angles to identify anything that might be Marcus or his equipment. For 12 days, teams combed the frozen landscape. They found nothing. No equipment, no clothing, no sign that Marcus Hjelm had ever been there beyond the footprints that led nowhere. The official search was called off on March 26th. Norwegian authorities classified the case as a presumed death due to exposure, noting that survival in Arctic conditions without proper shelter was impossible beyond a few hours. Marcus's family held a memorial service in Bergen on April 15th. His camera equipment was listed as lost. The insurance company paid Elena his life insurance benefit. The file was archived, but the Arctic keeps its secrets differently than other places. 18 months later, on September 23, 2020, 3 university students from Oslo were hiking near the Monaco-Breen Glacier, 47 kilometers from where Marcus had disappeared. The glacier had been retreating steadily due to climate change, exposing ground that had been frozen for decades. The students, Astrid Haugen, Erik Nilsson, and Maria Johansson, were conducting research on glacial recession patterns, photographing newly exposed terrain for their geology thesis. Around midday, Astrid noticed something unusual protruding from a patch of ice near the glacier's edge. At first, she assumed it was rock or debris uncovered by the melting, but as the group approached, the object's outline became unmistakably human. "We thought it was a mannequin at first," Astrid said later. "The position was too perfect, too composed. Real people don't freeze like that." Marcus Hjelm sat upright in the ice, legs crossed, body leaning slightly forward in the classic photographer's crouch. His right eye was pressed to the viewfinder of a professional camera, his left eye closed in concentration. His hands gripped the camera body with relaxed competence, finger positioned on the shutter release as if he'd just taken a photograph. His expression was serene, almost meditative. None of the contorted features typically associated with death by freezing. He looked exactly like a photographer who had paused between shots to study his subject through the lens. The ice around him was crystal clear, like a museum display case. Every detail was perfectly preserved. The texture of his winter jacket, individual strands of his blonde hair, even the breath vapor that had crystallized around his face in the moment of death. The preservation was so complete that the students initially hesitated to call authorities, uncertain whether they were looking at a body or an incredibly realistic art installation. But this was unmistakably Marcus Hjelm. His face matched the photographs Elena had provided to search teams 18 months earlier. His equipment was identical to what had been reported missing: professional camera bodies, expensive lenses, the distinctive red camera strap he'd used for years. What made no sense was the location. 47 kilometers separated the spot where Marcus was found from his last known position near the rental cabin. The terrain between these 2 points was brutal. A landscape of crevasses, unstable ice formations, and elevation changes that would challenge experienced mountaineers traveling light. Marcus had been carrying 20 pounds of camera equipment, in darkness, in sub-zero temperatures, across ground that required technical climbing skills to navigate safely. The students called Norwegian police at 1:47 p.m. The first responders arrived by helicopter at 4:23 p.m., followed by a forensic team and officials from the Svalbard Environmental Protection Agency. They established a perimeter around the site, documented the scene with extensive photographs, and began the delicate process of extracting Marcus's body from the ice. The extraction took 6 hours. The ice had to be melted gradually to avoid damaging the body or the evidence it might contain. As warm water dissolved the frozen shell that had preserved Marcus for 18 months, additional details emerged that deepened rather than resolved the mystery. His camera equipment was in perfect working condition. The batteries, despite 18 months of Arctic storage, retained enough charge to power the cameras. The lenses showed no condensation or ice damage. Most remarkably, the memory cards were intact and readable. They contained 247 photographs. The first 216 images were exactly what investigators expected to find on the memory card of a professional Aurora photographer. Shot after shot of spectacular northern lights displays, green curtains of light stretching across star-filled skies, aurora formations reflected in patches of clear ice, time-lapse sequences capturing the aurora's movement and evolution throughout the night. These photographs were extraordinary even by Marcus's standards. The aurora display he'd captured was massive, covering nearly the entire visible sky in complex patterns of light that seemed to pulse and flow like living organisms. The technical quality was flawless. Perfect exposure, sharp focus, compositions that demonstrated both artistic vision and complete mastery of challenging conditions. But it was the final 31 images that transformed Marcus Hjelm's disappearance from a tragic accident into something that defied explanation. The sequence began normally enough. Image 217 showed a typical aurora formation, bands of green and blue light dancing across the northern horizon. But in image 218, something had changed. The aurora patterns had shifted into geometric shapes, perfect triangles and rectangles of light that hung motionless in the sky like enormous illuminated billboards suspended in space. Natural aurora formations are fluid, organic, constantly shifting as solar particles interact with Earth's magnetic field. They don't form geometric patterns, they don't remain stationary. The aurora in Marcus's photographs violated every known principle of atmospheric physics. Image 219 showed the geometric patterns expanding, multiplying. Where there had been 3 triangular formations, now there were dozens, a complex grid of light structures that covered the entire northern sky. The timestamp indicated these photographs had been taken in rapid succession, but the aurora patterns in each frame were completely different, suggesting movement too fast for natural phenomena, but too organized for chaos. Images 220 through 245 documented what could only be described as a light show of impossible complexity. Geometric patterns dissolved and reformed. Perfect circles of brilliant white light appeared and vanished. Formations that resembled written symbols in no known language stretched across the aurora like messages written in fire. Throughout this sequence, Marcus's camera settings remained consistent with professional aurora photography. His technical approach hadn't changed. Same ISO settings, same exposure times, same focus points. Whatever he was photographing, he was treating it as a normal aurora display, suggesting either extraordinary professional composure or complete failure to recognize that what he was seeing couldn't exist. Image 246 was different. The geometric patterns were gone, replaced by a single massive formation that filled the frame from edge to edge. It appeared to be a tunnel, or opening in the sky itself, a perfect circle of absolute darkness surrounded by rings of brilliant light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Stars were visible through the dark center, but they weren't stars in the correct positions for March in the Arctic. The constellation patterns were wrong, as if the opening revealed a different sky entirely. The final image, number 247, was almost entirely black. At first, investigators assumed the photograph was a mistake, an accidental shot fired as Marcus's fingers went numb from cold. But digital enhancement revealed details that made this image the most disturbing of all. In the lower right corner, barely visible against the darkness, stood a human silhouette. The figure was tall, thin, completely motionless. It stood on what appeared to be snow or ice, but there was no visible landscape around it, just the silhouette suspended in black space like a paper cutout against a void. The figure's proportions were wrong somehow, too tall and too thin to be human, with arms that hung slightly too long at its sides. Most unsettling was the figure's position relative to the camera. Based on the perspective and scale, it should have been standing approximately 30 meters from Marcus's position. But the students who found Marcus's body had searched the entire area. They'd photographed every square meter of exposed ground. There had been no footprints near his body except the ones leading to his final position, no footprints leading away. The forensic team completed their initial examination of Marcus's body at the scene. What they found challenged every assumption about how humans die in Arctic conditions. Marcus showed none of the typical signs of hypothermia death. His clothing was properly fastened and arranged. He hadn't removed layers in the confusion that often accompanies severe hypothermia. His hands weren't clenched or contorted. His facial expression suggested peace, even concentration, rather than the agony typically associated with freezing to death. His watch had stopped at 11:47 p.m. on March 12th, approximately 30 minutes after his final phone call to Elena. But the camera's internal timestamp indicated he'd continued photographing until 5:52 a.m. on March 13th, more than 6 hours after his watch stopped. Either the camera's clock was wrong, or Marcus had remained active for hours after his watch indicated he should have been dead. The forensic team carefully documented everything: Marcus's position, the condition of his equipment, the exact location where he was found. They took GPS coordinates, measured distances, photographed the site from every angle. The body was transported to Tromsø for full autopsy, the equipment to a forensics lab for detailed analysis. But even as the official investigation began, unofficial questions were already circulating among the rescue personnel and investigators who had seen Marcus's final photographs. The images violated everything they understood about natural atmospheric phenomena. The geometric patterns, the impossible light formations, the tunnel that seemed to open onto a different sky entirely, none of it could be explained by known science. The autopsy results, released 3 weeks later, raised more questions than they answered. Dr. Carrie Stromberg, the forensic pathologist who examined Marcus's body, had performed over 200 cold weather death investigations during her career in northern Norway. She'd seen every variation of how the Arctic kills: hypothermia, falls through ice, exposure complicated by injury or exhaustion. Marcus Hjelm fit none of the established patterns. The preservation was unlike anything in my experience, Dr. Stromberg reported. Typically, bodies recovered from ice show cellular damage from the freezing process, ice crystal formation that destroys tissue structure, discoloration from blood pooling, signs of the body's final struggle against cold. This body showed none of these indicators. The tissue analysis revealed that Marcus had died almost instantly. His blood chemistry suggested no prolonged struggle with hypothermia, no gradual shutdown of organs as core temperature dropped. One moment, he had been alive and functioning normally. The next, he was dead. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, but Dr. Stromberg admitted privately that this was more administrative necessity than medical conclusion. Something stopped his heart, she told the investigating team. But I can't tell you what, there were no signs of trauma. No evidence of pre-existing cardiac conditions, no toxins in his blood. A healthy 34-year-old man's heart simply stopped beating, and he died so quickly that his body didn't have time to react to the cold. The equipment analysis proved equally mystifying. Technicians at the Norwegian Institute of Technology examined Marcus's cameras, lenses, and memory cards with forensic precision. The equipment had been exposed to 18 months of Arctic conditions, temperature extremes, moisture, potential impacts from shifting ice. It should have been destroyed. Instead, every component functioned perfectly. The camera bodies showed no moisture damage, the lenses were clear, their coatings intact, the memory cards contained no corrupted data. Even the battery levels were impossible. The cameras retained 37% charge after 18 months in sub-zero storage, when they should have been completely drained within days. We tested identical equipment under controlled Arctic conditions, explained Dr. Lars Hedman, the lead forensic technician. Camera batteries fail at temperatures below -20 Celsius. Memory cards become unreliable. Lens elements contract and expand, breaking seals and allowing moisture intrusion. This equipment should have been useless after 1 week in those conditions. After 18 months, it should have been scrap metal. But the technical impossibilities paled beside the content of those final 31 photographs. The Norwegian Meteorological Institute was asked to analyze the Aurora formations Marcus had captured. Their report, classified at the time but later leaked to Norwegian media, concluded that the patterns were inconsistent with known magnetospheric phenomena. Aurora formations are created by solar particles interacting with Earth's magnetic field, explained Dr. Ingrid Haugen, the Institute's lead atmospheric physicist. The particles follow predictable paths determined by magnetic field lines. They create organic, flowing patterns that shift and evolve gradually over time. What these photographs show violates the basic physics of aurora formation. The geometric patterns, the perfect triangles, rectangles, and circles of light required a level of organization impossible in natural systems. The rapid transitions between completely different formations suggested movement at speeds that would require impossible energy inputs. Most problematically, several photographs showed aurora formations below the horizon line, which was physically impossible given how aurora occur in the upper atmosphere. Either these photographs are sophisticated fabrications, Dr. Haugen concluded, or they document phenomena that exist outside our current understanding of atmospheric physics. The fabrication theory was thoroughly investigated. Digital forensics experts examined the images for signs of manipulation, composite elements, artificial lighting, computer-generated effects. The analysis took 6 months and involved specialists from 3 different institutions. They found nothing. The images were authentic, captured in camera under the conditions Marcus had reported. The metadata was consistent with his equipment and shooting style. The sequential timestamps matched the progression of a normal photography session. If the images had been fabricated, the manipulation was so sophisticated that it left no detectable traces, a level of skill that would have required resources and expertise far beyond what Marcus possessed. Meanwhile, Elena Anderson was conducting her own investigation. In the months following Marcus's disappearance, she'd maintained contact with other Aurora photographers, hoping someone might have information about unusual phenomena in the Arctic. Most dismissed her inquiries politely. Professional photographers were reluctant to discuss anything that might sound unprofessional or delusional. But Elena was persistent, and gradually she uncovered accounts that echoed elements of Marcus's final photographs. A photographer from Finland described aurora formations that seemed to respond to his presence, shifting patterns whenever he adjusted his camera position. A researcher in Iceland reported geometric light patterns during a particularly intense geomagnetic storm, but his photographs had been corrupted by what he assumed was equipment failure. A team from the University of Alaska mentioned unusual aurora behavior during their research, but their funding had been cut before they could investigate further. None of these accounts had been published. None had been taken seriously by the scientific community. Each photographer or researcher had concluded that they'd experienced equipment malfunction, atmospheric distortion, or simple misperception under challenging conditions. Everyone had convinced themselves they'd been mistaken, Elena said, but when I described what Marcus had photographed, they all got quiet. Then they'd tell me about their own experiences, things they'd never reported because they knew no one would believe them. Elena compiled these accounts into an unofficial database. The patterns were subtle but consistent. Unusual aurora activity was most commonly reported during high-intensity geomagnetic storms in extremely remote locations by observers who were alone or in very small groups. The phenomena lasted minutes at most, and in every case, the observers had convinced themselves they'd been mistaken. Marcus was different, Elena realized. He didn't dismiss what he was seeing. He kept photographing. The official investigation concluded on December 15, 2020. Norwegian authorities filed a final report classifying Marcus Hjelm's death as accidental, caused by cardiac arrest during extreme weather exposure. The unusual circumstances, his location 47 kilometers from his planned shooting site, the impossible preservation of his body and equipment, the unexplained final photographs, were noted but not explained. Some cases resist complete resolution, the report stated. While many questions surrounding Mr. Hjelm's death remain unanswered, we have found no evidence of criminal activity or unusual circumstances that would warrant continued investigation. The photographs were returned to Elena as Marcus's legal heir. The case file was archived. Officially, the matter was closed, but Elena couldn't let it end there. She returned to Svalbard in March 2021, exactly 2 years after Marcus's disappearance. Using his GPS coordinates and camera data, she retraced his final night as closely as possible. She hiked to the ridge where he'd planned to photograph, then continued to the glacier where his body had been found. The terrain was even more challenging than investigators had described. The route from Marcus's planned photography location to where his body was discovered crossed unstable ice fields, steep ravines, and sections that required mountaineering skills to navigate safely. Even with proper equipment and daylight, the journey took Elena and her guide 7 hours to complete. There's no way Marcus walked this route in darkness, Elena concluded. Not carrying camera equipment, not without leaving a trail, not without knowledge of the specific route through the ice fields. Yet somehow he had ended up precisely where the students found him, positioned as if he'd sat down deliberately to take a photograph, then never stood up again. Elena spent 3 nights at the site, sleeping in the same cabin Marcus had rented, hiking to the same locations he'd planned to photograph. The weather was clear, the aurora activity moderate. She took hundreds of photographs with equipment identical to what Marcus had used. Her images showed normal aurora formations, beautiful but scientifically unremarkable. On her final night, Elena hiked to the exact spot where Marcus's body had been discovered. The glacier had continued retreating, exposing more ground that had been frozen for decades. She set up her camera in the same position Marcus had been found, pointing toward the same section of sky his final photographs had captured. At 11:47 p.m., the exact time Marcus's watch had stopped 2 years earlier, Elena began photographing. The aurora that night was spectacular. Green curtains of light danced across the star-filled sky, reflecting off the glacial ice in patterns that seemed almost choreographed. Elena shot for 3 hours, capturing formation after formation, each more beautiful than the last. But they were normal aurora, organic, flowing, explicable by known physics. Whatever Marcus had photographed during his final hours remained unique to that night, that place, that specific moment, when the conditions had aligned in ways that might never occur again. Elena returned to Bergen with answers to some questions and deeper mysteries around others. She'd proven that Marcus couldn't have reached his final location through any normal means. She'd documented that his final photographs captured phenomena that no one else had recorded before or since, but she still didn't know how he'd died, how he'd been preserved, or what those final images actually showed. The story might have ended there, another unsolved mystery filed away in Norwegian archives, but Elena made a decision that changed everything. In June 2021, she published Marcus's final photographs online. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Aurora photographers from around the world contacted Elena with their own accounts of unusual phenomena. Atmospheric physicists analyzed the images and published papers acknowledging that current theories couldn't explain what Marcus had captured. The photographs were featured in scientific journals, photography magazines, and documentary films. But more importantly, Elena's decision to make the images public encouraged other observers to report similar experiences. Reports began flowing in from across the Arctic: Alaska, Canada, Greenland, Siberia. Photographers and researchers who had previously kept quiet about unusual aurora sightings began sharing their stories. The accounts were remarkably consistent. Geometric light formations, impossible movement patterns, phenomena that lasted minutes and left observers questioning their own perceptions. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a magnetosphere physicist at the University of Colorado, began compiling and analyzing these reports. Her preliminary findings, published in the Journal of Atmospheric Physics in early 2022, suggested that the phenomena were real but occurred under very specific conditions that were only beginning to be understood. "We're dealing with magnetospheric interactions of unprecedented complexity," Dr. Martinez wrote. "Current models of aurora formation may be incomplete. These observations suggest that under extreme geomagnetic conditions, the aurora may exhibit behaviors that challenge our fundamental understanding of atmospheric physics." The scientific community remained divided. Many researchers dismissed the reports as observer error or equipment malfunction. Others argued that the consistency of accounts across multiple independent observers suggested genuine phenomena worthy of investigation. But for Elena, the scientific debate was secondary to a more personal realization. Marcus's death had not been in vain. His final photographs, captured in circumstances that cost him his life, had opened a window into natural phenomena that might otherwise have remained hidden. His willingness to document what he was seeing, even when it defied explanation, had preserved evidence of something extraordinary. Marcus always said that photographers are witnesses, Elena reflected. "We don't just capture beauty. We record what exists, even when people would prefer not to see it." Those final photographs were his last act of witnessing. Whatever he saw that night, whatever killed him, he made sure it wouldn't disappear with him. The investigation into Marcus Hjelm's death officially remains closed. Norwegian authorities have not reopened the case despite the ongoing scientific debate about his final photographs. His body was buried in Bergen in spring 2021, attended by family, friends, and photographers from across Europe who recognized that they'd lost not just a colleague, but a pioneer. Elena still lives in Bergen, in the apartment she'd shared with Marcus. His camera equipment sits on shelves in their spare room, clean and ready for use, though she's never touched it. The final memory cards remain in a safety deposit box at her bank, not because she fears losing them, but because she's not sure the world is ready for what they contain. People want to believe that nature is predictable, that we understand the rules, Elena said during a rare interview in 2022. But Marcus's photographs prove that we don't. There are still phenomena in our world that exist beyond our models, beyond our expectations. We like to think we've mapped everything, cataloged everything, explained everything. But the Arctic keeps its secrets, and sometimes it reveals them to people brave enough or foolish enough to look. The cabin where Marcus spent his final days has been renovated and remains available for rental. Aurora photographers occasionally stay there, drawn by the story and hoping to capture something similar to what Marcus documented. None have succeeded. The aurora in that region continues to follow predictable patterns, beautiful but scientifically unremarkable. But Elena has noticed something in the reports filed by photographers who stay at the cabin. Nothing as dramatic as Marcus's experience, but subtle anomalies that suggest the location retains some unique properties. Aurora formations that last slightly longer than expected. Light patterns that seem marginally more organized than random. Photographs that capture details the naked eye couldn't see. Maybe Marcus found something that night, Elena muses. Maybe he documented a phenomenon that occurs once in a generation, under conditions so specific that replication is virtually impossible. Or maybe he discovered that the boundary between our world and something else is thinner than we imagine. and what he photographed was a glimpse through that boundary. She pauses, looking at a framed print from Marcus's final shoot. Image number 216, the last normal Aurora photograph he ever took. The Aurora in the image is magnificent, a classic formation of green light dancing across the Arctic sky. But I think there's a third possibility, Elena continues. Maybe the extraordinary was always there, and Marcus was just the first person willing to keep photographing when everyone else would have stopped. Maybe the Aurora has always been more than we thought, and we've been too afraid to look closely enough to see it. The final image on Marcus's memory card, the nearly black frame with its impossible silhouette, remains unexplained. Digital enhancement has revealed no additional details. The figure's identity, its location, its relationship to Marcus's death, all remain mysteries. But sometimes, late at night, Elena studies that final photograph and wonders if Marcus had encountered something in the Arctic darkness that night. Something that appeared in the impossible Aurora he'd been photographing. Something that had been watching him just as intently as he'd been documenting it. The investigation is closed. The case is archived. The official conclusion stands: Marcus Yelm died of cardiac arrest during a photography expedition, victim of the harsh Arctic environment he'd spent his career documenting. But the photographs endure, and in laboratories and universities around the world, scientists continue studying images that shouldn't exist, captured by a man who died in circumstances that make no sense, preserved in ice that defied every law of preservation science understands. The Aurora Borealis continues to dance across Arctic skies, beautiful and mysterious as it has been for millennia. Most observers see exactly what science predicts they should see: solar particles creating predictable patterns of colored light in the upper atmosphere. But sometimes, under conditions that remain poorly understood, the Aurora reveals something more. Something that exists at the edge of human comprehension, captured by those brave enough or foolish enough to keep looking when wisdom suggests they should turn away. Marcus Yelm was such an observer. His final photographs stand as testament to the idea that reality extends beyond the boundaries of our current understanding, and that the price of witnessing the extraordinary can be everything we have to give. In the end, perhaps that was a price Marcus had always been willing to pay.